Welcome to session 4 of our study on the books of Joshua and Judges. In this session, we're going to read and discuss chapters 8 through 12, completing the Book of Conquest, the first half of the book of Joshua. Another battle in Ai precedes the introduction to the Gibeonites and the war against the kings of the north and of the south. In chapter 3, if you remember, we read about the Ark of the Covenant crossing the Jordan River. In chapter 6, the ark played a central role in the conquering of Jericho. In chapter 8, in the third and final stage of its travels, the ark goes to Shechem, its final resting place near Mount Ebal and Gerizim. All this in a moment, but first we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Again, if you remember, in chapter 7, we found that Achan had violated the rule of the ban by taking silver and gold in the assault on Jericho. As a consequence, the Israelite attack on the city-state of Ai resulted in failure and the loss of Israelite lives. In chapter 8, Joshua and the Israelite army tries again, but this time with God's blessing. So we begin chapter 8, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and go up to Ai. See, I have handed over to you the king of Ai with his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may take its spoil and plunder its livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush against the city behind it." Like Jericho, Ai is to be put to the ban, its structures burned and all its inhabitants massacred, but an exception is made for booty, which the conquering Israelites are allowed to take. We go on to verse 3. So Joshua and all the fighting men set out to go up against Ai. Joshua chose 30,000 warriors and sent them out by night with the command, "You shall lie in ambush against the city behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you stay alert. I and all the people who are with me will approach the city. When they come out against us as before, we will flee from them. They will come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city, for they will say, 'They are fleeing from us as before.' While we flee from them, you shall rise up from the ambush and seize the city, for the Lord your God will give it to your hands. And when you have taken the city, you shall set the city on fire, doing as the Lord has ordered. See, I have commanded you." So Joshua sent them out, and they went to the place of the ambush and lay between Bethel and Ai to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent the night with the people. God said he would deliver Ai to Joshua, but it is Joshua's shrewdness as a strategist that brings about the fall of the town. The elaboration of the details of military strategy is not typical of biblical narrative. Scholars have pointed out a similarity not only in strategy but also in the wording between this story and an account of the siege of Gibeah in the civil war reported in Judges 20. And it is generally thought that this story draws on the one in Judges. Joshua shrewdly capitalizes on the previous defeat of the Israelite army at Ai by seeming to repeat the same tactical error. Let's go on to verse 10. In the morning, Joshua rose early and mustered the people and went up with the elders of Israel before the people to Ai. All the fighting men who were with him went up and drew near the city and camped on the north side of Ai with a ravine between them and Ai. Taking about 5,000 men, he set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai to the west of the city. So they stationed the forces, the main encampment that was north of the city and its rear guard west of the city. And Joshua went that night into the valley. When the king of Ai saw this, he and all his people, the inhabitants of the city, hurried out early in the morning to the meeting place facing the Arabah to meet Israel in battle. But he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. And Joshua and all Israel made a pretense of being beaten before them and fled in the direction of the wilderness. So all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them. As they pursued Joshua, they were drawn away from the city. There was not a man left in Ai who did not go out after Israel. They left the city open and pursued Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out the sword that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it unto your hand." And Joshua stretched out the sword that was in his hand toward the city. As soon as he stretched out his hand, the troops in ambush rose quickly out of their place and rushed forward. They entered the city, took it, and at once set the city on fire. So when the men of Ai looked back, the smoke of the city was rising to the sky. They had no power to flee this way or that, for the people who fled to the wilderness turned back against their pursuers. When Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city and that the smoke of the city was rising, then they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. And the other Israelites came out from the city against them, so that they were surrounded by Israelites, some on one side and some on the other. And Israel struck them down until no one was left who survived or escaped. But the king of Ai was taken alive and brought to Joshua. There's a fluctuation of perspectives in the ambush of Ai. The battle is written about from the point of view of Joshua and the Israelites, with two exceptions. First, after the notice that Joshua spent the night in the valley in verse 13, the narrative inserts the point of view of the king of Ai, who sees the Israelite force camped in the valley and rushes out to meet them in war. The narrator immediately comments on the perception of the king as one of ignorance. He did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Second, at the moment of the ambush, the narrative turns to the perception of the warriors who see smoke in the city and flee from battle. The introduction of the perception of the enemy is unusual in the book of Joshua, where Canaanites' other tends to be objectified, raising the question of the author's intentions. These two episodes contrast the perception of the enemy before the battle and after it. Before the battle, the enemy's perception is one of arrogance. The sudden and unexpected destruction of the city is a moment of recognition underscored in the perception of the army. This parallels the conflict between Pharaoh and Israel in the Red Sea in Exodus 14 and 15. There we see the arrogance of Pharaoh, which is quickly reversed when the Egyptian army recognizes the power of God in the sea. Let's go on to verse 24. When Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness where they pursued them, and when all of them to the very last had fallen by the edge of the sword, all Israel returned to Ai and attacked it with the edge of the sword. The total of those who fell that day, both men and women, was 12,000, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the sword until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Only the livestock and the spoil of that city Israel plundered for themselves according to the word of the Lord that he had issued to Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree, threw it down at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. Many modern scholars think that it is likely that the form of execution of the king should be translated as impaled on a pole instead of hanged on a tree. In any event, there was no honorable burial for the king of Ai, having been thrown to the ground and buried under a heap of stones. We go on to verse 30. Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord of God of Israel, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of unhewn stones on which no iron tool has been used. and they offered it as burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed offerings of well-being. And there, in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses that he had written. All Israel, alien as well as native-born, with their elders and officers, their judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark in front of the Levitical priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded earlier that they should bless the people of Israel. And afterward he read all the words of the law, blessing and curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones and the aliens who resided among them. This section invokes the two mountains of blessing and curse mentioned in Deuteronomy 11:26 through 32, and a direct implementation of the command in Deuteronomy 27:2 and 3. On the day that you cross the Jordan into the land that the Lord your God is about to give you, you shall set up great stones and coat them with plaster, and you shall write on them the words of this teaching. But this doesn't happen exactly the way that Moses told them to do it. It doesn't occur immediately after the crossing of the Jordan. And Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are about 20 miles north of Ai, not in the immediate vicinity, so it didn't happen immediately after the battle. It is with these ceremonies, though, that at the two mountains near the town of Shechem, that we complete the journey of the Ark of the Covenant that first began in chapter 3 with the crossing of the Jordan. We've talked in previous sessions about the book of Joshua appearing to be the product of at least two and probably multiple sources. We're going to throw in another wrinkle into the puzzle here. As you know, the Old Testament was not written in modern-day English. In this study, we're primarily using a translation called the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Modern translators primarily translate from the Hebrew, but not the original ancient scrolls that were created in 600 or 500 or whenever BCE. Those don't exist anymore. Between the 7th and 10th century CE, that is the current era, a group of Jews known as Masoretes took old manuscripts, edited and copied, and codified the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, creating what is now known as the Masoretic text. It is the Masoretic text written about 1,000 years ago, not the ancient scrolls written by Jeremiah or Ezekiel or whoever from the 2,500 years ago that modern scholars use to create today's English translations. But also, around the 1st or 2nd century BCE, a Greek version of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint was written and distributed because many Jews in the diaspora no longer spoke Hebrew. Greek was the universal language of the time in the known Western world. If you remember, our New Testament was actually originally written in Greek. Modern scholars also use the Septuagint as a source for their translations. The Masoretic text and the Septuagint do not always exactly agree. In fact, in the 8th chapter of Joshua, there are significant differences in the narrative of the Battle of Ai. In the Masoretic text, the events extend over 3 days and range over the area from Ai and Bethel to the mountains of Ebal and Gerizim. Joshua's camped north of the city. There are two ambush parties, one of 30,000 and one of 5,000. In the Septuagint, the battle against Ai takes place over 2 days instead of 3, in a much smaller region. There is only one ambush party of 30,000, not two, and Joshua's camp is on the east side of the city. In the Septuagint, the cultic ceremony at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim takes place in chapter 9, not chapter 8. There are other differences, but we're already going to go long in this session. So there is also a third edition of Joshua that was discovered in Qumran in 1947, a part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This version, labeled 4Q Josh, is also a little different in places than the other two versions. We don't plan to point out all the differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint that are found in Joshua and Judges, but for now, just be aware that these differences exist. We now go to chapter 9, where we read about the Gibeonites and their great deception. So chapter 9, verse 1. Now when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and the lowland all along the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this, they gathered together with one accord to fight Joshua and Israel. So by beyond the Jordan, this means Canaan. Beyond the Jordan from the viewpoint of the Israelites who had just come from the eastern side of the Jordan. Though elsewhere it almost always refers to the Transjordan territory. Again, east, where the Israelites had just come from. We go on to verse 3. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon had heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning. And they went and prepared provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes. And all the provisions were dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him, to the Israelites, we have come from a far country, so now make a treaty with us. But the Israelites said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us, then how can we make a treaty with you? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you, and where do you come from? They said to him, your servants have come from a very far country because of the name of your Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him, of all that he did in Egypt, and of all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, King Sihon of Heshbon and King Og of Bashan, who live in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Come now and make a treaty with us. Here is our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now see, it is dry and moldy. These wineskins were new when we filled them. You see, they are burst. These garments and our sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So leaders partook of their provisions and did not ask direction from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them, guaranteeing their lives by a treaty. And the leaders of the congregation were sworn an oath to them. With the evidence of the recent destruction of Jericho and Ai, the Gibeonites seem aware that the Israelites are embarked on a campaign to annihilate the indigenous population of Canaan. So they pretend to be from a land far away from Canaan. Taking the Gibeonites' moldy bread and breaking bread with these strangers was a way of ritually confirming a treaty of peace with them, which is what they did. We're going to verse 16. But when 3 days had passed after they had made a treaty with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and they were living among them. So the Israelites set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Sherepiah, Beruth, and Kirjath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. But all the leaders said to all the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we must not touch them. This is what we will do to them. We will let them live so that wrath may not come upon us because of the oath that we swore to them. The leaders said to them, let them live, so that they became woodcutters and drawers of water for all the congregation, as the leaders had decided concerning them. So verse 17 says they reached the Gibeonite cities on the third day. 3 days, as we remember from the episode of the crossing the Jordan, means a short period of time. But this also tells us that the Gibeonite cities were probably well within the borders of Canaan. but they have already made this treaty, so they don't break it. We go on to verse 22. Joshua summoned them and said to them, "Why did you deceive us, saying, 'We are very far from you,' while in fact you are living among us? Now therefore you are cursed, and some of you shall always be slaves, woodcutters, and drawers of water for the house of my God." They answered Joshua, "Because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. So we were in great fear for our lives because of you and did this thing. And now we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us." This is what he did for them. He saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. But on that day Joshua made them woodcutters and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to continue to this day in the place that he should choose. The Gibeonites have somehow been given a full report of the promise of the land and the program of genocide spelled out in Deuteronomy. If you ever wondered why the Gibeonites were the woodcutters and drawers of water for the Israelites, this story explains that. We also notice the phrase "to this day" in verse 27. It is not clear here what day this is, but it's clearly a long time after the events of the narrative unfolded. Chapters 10 and 11 tell of the war against the southern kings and against the northern kings. Chapter 10 recounts the Israelite rescue of the Gibeonites from the 5 Amorite kings and the subsequent destruction of the southern cities in the promised land. We begin with the first verse of chapter 10. When King Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made a peace with Israel and were among them, he became greatly frightened because Gibeon was a large city, like one of the royal cities, and was larger than Ai, and all its men were warriors. So King Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem sent a message to King Hoham of Hebron, to King Pharam of Jarmuth, to King Japhia of Lachish, and to King Deber of Eglon, saying, "Come up and help me, let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the Israelites." Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered their forces and went up with all their armies and camped against Gibeon and made war with it. So Gibeon was not a monarchy, it didn't have a king, but its size and importance make it equivalent of a royal city or a royal town. Let's go on to verse 6. And the Gibeonites sent to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, saying, "Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites who live in the hill country are gathered against us." So Joshua went up from Gilgal, and he and all the fighting force with him, all the mighty warriors. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have handed them over to you. Not one of them shall stand before you." So Joshua came upon them suddenly, having marched up all night from Gilgal. And the Lord threw them into panic before Israel, who inflicted a crushing blow on them at Gibeon, and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled before Israel, while they were going down to the slope of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down huge stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the Israelites killed with the sword. We notice that Joshua and the Israelites are back in Gilgal when they receive the message from the Gibeonites. That is still their main camp. We go to verse 12. On the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites, Joshua spoke to the Lord, and he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and the moon in the valley of Al-Jalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in mid-heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded a human voice, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. The book of Yashar, now a lost text, is also mentioned in 2 Samuel 1:18. There appears to be three separate narratives here, perhaps from three different sources. The first ended with verse 11, followed by a short interlude that we just read, verses 12 through 15. The second narrative is made up of verses 16 through 27, which we'll read now. A third, beginning with verse 28, we'll read in a moment. Verse 16. Meanwhile, these 5 kings fled and hid themselves in the cave of Makkedah. And it was told Joshua, the 5 kings had been found hidden in a cave at Makkedah. Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and set men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them from the rear. Do not let them enter their towns, for the Lord your God has given them into your hand. When Joshua and the Israelites had finished inflicting a very great blow on them until they were wiped out, and when the survivors had entered into the fortified towns, all the people returned safe to Joshua at the camp at Makkedah. No one dared to speak against any of the Israelites. Then Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings to me from the cave. They did so and brought the 5 kings out to him from the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Elgon. When they brought the kings out to Joshua, Joshua summoned all the Israelites and said to the chiefs of the warriors who had gone with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. Then they came near and put their feet on their necks. And Joshua said to them, do not be afraid or dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for this the Lord will do to all the enemies against whom you fight. Afterward Joshua struck them down and put them to death, and he hung them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. At sunset Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves. They set large stones against the mouth of the cave. They remain to this very day. Putting feet on the necks of kings was a symbolic gesture by victors for subjecting the defeated enemies. It would be somewhat odd to hang dead bodies on trees, so here again it's more likely that they impaled them on poles. Verse 28 in the next narrative. Joshua took Makkedah on that day and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed every person in it. He left no one remaining. And he did to the king of Makkedah as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua passed on from Makkedah and all Israel with him to Lebah and fought against Lebanah. The Lord gave it also and its king into the hands of Israel. And he struck it with the edge of the sword and every person in it. He left no one remaining in it. And he did to its king as he had done to the king of Jericho. Next, Joshua passed on from Lebnah and all Israel with him to Lachish, and he laid siege to it and assaulted it. The Lord gave Lachish to the hand of Israel, and he took it on the second day and struck it with the edge of the sword, every person in it, as he had done to Lebnah. When King Horam of Gezer came up to help Lachish, and Joshua struck him and his people, leaving him no survivors. From Lachish, Joshua passed on with all Israel to Eglon, and they laid siege to it and assaulted it, and they took it that day and struck it with the edge of the sword, and every person in it he utterly destroyed that day, as he had done to Lachish. Then Joshua went up with all Israel from Eglon to Hebron. They assaulted it, and took it, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and its king, and its towns, and every person in it. He left no one remaining, just as he had done to Eglon, and utterly destroyed it with every person in it. Then Joshua, with all Israel, turned back to Debar, and assaulted it, and he took it with its king and all its towns, and they struck them with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed every person in it. He left no one remaining, just as he had done to Hebron, and as he had done to Libnah and its king. So he did to Debar and its king. So Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country and the Negeb, and the lowland and its slopes and all their kings. He left no one remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded. And Joshua defeated them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza and all the country of Goshen as far as Gibeon. Joshua took all these kings and their land at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. This summary in these last few verses explains that the momentous effect of these victories was the capture of the entire South. In this way, a limited number of individual conquest reports are expanded to cover the whole land. We go on to chapter 11 in the triumphant campaign in the north. This whole chapter appears to have been composed to create a symmetrical complement to the account of the defeat of the southern alliance in the previous chapter. So chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. When King Jabin of Hazor heard of this, he sent to King Joab of Maon, to the king of Shechem, and to the king of Ashbar, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country and in the Arabah south of Shinroth, and in the lowland and the Neparah Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites and under Hermon of the land of Mizpah. They came out with all their troops, a great army in number like the sand on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. All these kings joined their forces and then came and camped together at the waters of Mermon to fight with Israel. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will hand over all of them, slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." So Joshua came suddenly upon them with all his fighting force by the waters of Mermon, and fell upon them. And the Lord handed them over to Israel, who attacked them and chased them as far as the great Sidon and Mizrapoth Mam, and eastward as far as the valley of Mizpeh. They struck them down until they had no one left remaining. And Joshua did to them as the Lord commanded him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. The Israelites did not generally use chariots for another 2 centuries. The Canaanite chariots, in all likelihood, were made of wood, hence the burning. So we go on to verse 10. Joshua turned back at that time and took Hazor and struck its king down with the sword. Before that time, Hazor was the head of all those kingdoms. And they put to the sword all who were in it, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. And all the towns of the kings and their kings Joshua took and struck them with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded. But Israel burned none of the towns that stood on mounds except Hazor, which Joshua did burn. All the spoil of these towns and the livestock the Israelites plundered for themselves, but all the people they struck down with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. And they did not leave any who breathed, as the Lord had commanded his servant Moses. So Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all the Lord had commanded Moses. Again we see the ban to put to the sword all who were in it, utterly destroying them. Let's go on to verse 16. So Joshua took all the land, the hill country, and all the Negeb, and all the land of Goshen, and all the lowland of the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel and the lowland, from Mount Hayak, which rises toward Seir, as far as Baal Gad, in the valley of Lebanon, below Mount Hermon. He took all their kings, struck them down, and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a town that made peace with the Israelites except for the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All were taken in battle, for it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts so that they would come against Israel in battle, in order that they might be utterly destroyed and might receive no mercy, but be exterminated, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time, Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debar, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their towns. None of the Anakim was left in the land of the Israelites. Some remained only in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war. Verse 16 refers to the hill country of Israel, and verse 21 to the hill country of Judah. This probably reflects an awareness of the division into a northern and southern kingdom after the death of Solomon. At this point, the conquest of all the land of Canaan is complete. In chapter 12, we are given an accounting of the land that was conquered and the kings that were killed. The first 6 verses of this chapter report the victories of Moses over the Transjordanian kings that were narrated in Numbers. So we begin with chapter 12, verse 1. Now these are the kings of the land whom the Israelites defeated, whose land they occupied beyond the Jordan toward the east, from the Wadi Aran to Mount Hermon, with the Arabah eastward. King Sihon of the Amorites, who lived at the Heshbon and ruled from Aror, which is on the edge of the Wadi Aran, and from the middle of the valley as far as the Wadi Jabbok, the boundary of the Amorites, that is, half of Gilead, and the Arabah to the sea of Chinnereth, eastward to the direction of Ben-Jerath, to the sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, southward to the foot of the slopes of Pisgah. And King Og of Bashan, one of the last of the Rephaim, who lived at Ashroth and at Edrei, and ruled over Mount Hermon and Salakah, and all Bashan to the boundary of the Geshurites and the Mathakites, and over half of Gilead to the boundary of King Shiron of Heshbon. Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the Israelites defeated them. Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave their land for a possession to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe Manasseh. The remainder of the chapter gives a list of the kings dispatched by Joshua. I'm not going to read this entire list. It includes names from the preceding narrative and also includes several kings mentioned earlier. I'm going to read a little bit, verse 7 through 8. In the following are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the Israelites defeated on the west side of the Jordan, from Balgad in the valley of Lebanon to Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir, and Joshua gave their land to the tribes of Israel as a possession according to their allotments, in the hill country, in the lowland, in the Arabah, in the slopes, in the wilderness, and in the Negeb, the land of the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And then we have the list, 31 kings in all. In session 5, we begin the book of apportionments, or the dividing of the land, the second half of the book of Joshua. We will discuss chapters 13 through 19, although we're not going to read each of these chapters during the video session. There is not a lot of narrative again until we get to chapter 22. Mostly a lot of lists, but there still will be plenty to discuss. So I hope you can join us in our discussion Monday evening. If you need to, send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org to get the Zoom link. Have a good week.